Alrighty, we're about 2 minutes past. I think we can go ahead and kick off. Hi, everyone. We're really excited that you joined us for the webinar today on managing software supply chain risks in embedded systems, featuring Chris Sundberg, who is Global Cybersecurity Engineer at Woodward. My name is Christian Capdeville. I'm the Product Marketing Leader here at FOSSA, and I'll be your host for today's presentation. Before I go over the agenda and introduce Chris, I would like to go over a few housekeeping notes. So first, we will try to answer any audience questions as they're submitted, but if we can't get to them, we will have time at the end for Q&A. So please go ahead and post any questions you have in that questions section. Next, this webinar is being recorded, and we will send it out after the event. And finally, we at FOSSA will be following up with you after the webinar with a few additional resources and see if there's anything we can do to help your organization with some of the supply chain challenges that we're going to be talking about today. So let us take a look at today's agenda. So we're going to start with a brief overview around the importance of software supply chain transparency. Won't spend too long there, but we want to talk about it in light of today's security and compliance challenges. Then we'll dive into some of the nuances specific to embedded systems. And the second part of the webinar will highlight strategies for navigating the roadblocks, security, open source compliance, SBOMs, and some of the other parts of software transparency, specifically in embedded. And then finally, we'll wrap up with some additional Q&A for anything that we weren't able to get to earlier in the presentation. Before I hand things off to Chris, kind of a quick word for anybody who's not familiar with FOSSA. Two main parts of what we do. One is around offering solutions for managing risks and gaining visibility into open source software. This includes identifying and remediating open source vulnerabilities, as well as identifying and complying with licenses in open source code. Now, the second part of what we do is around SBOM management, with support for generating SBOMs, ingesting SBOMs, and using SBOMs to inform things like vulnerability management, and also securely distributing SBOMs. Now, I'm really excited to introduce our speaker for today, Chris Sundberg. Like I mentioned, Chris is a global cybersecurity engineer at Woodward, which is an independent designer, manufacturer, and service provider of control solutions for the aerospace and industrial markets. Chris is also a leading expert in several facets of software transparency and trust. He's the co-lead for the SAE G32 Cyber Physical Systems Security Standard and the liaison for G34 Artificial Intelligence in Aviation Standard. He's also a big Colorado Avalanche hockey fan, but we'll save the debate around that for another day. So with that, Chris, I will hand things over to you to share a bit more about your background and kick off the presentation.
Thanks, Christian. Great to be here. Kind of like my bio says a little bit. I've been doing industrial control systems for about 20 years now, probably cybersecurity in there for about a little over 10 years around that as well. So a lot of it is embedded systems, which we'll dive into a little bit later. Just a little bit about Woodward. Woodward's been around for over 150 years. So we've kind of been out there for a long time. We've been doing electronic controls since the late 80s on a lot of different platforms in aviation and industrial. We are, kind of an independent tier supplier to a lot of OEMs and stuff like that. You never hear of a Woodward vehicle or a Woodward plane, but we do have parts in a lot of those items. So a couple of challenges we have is we do have a lot of electronic controls on the products we produce. And it's just so happens that we're kind of at that tail end of whatever we're trying to control. So we're directly controlling cyber physical systems. Oftentimes that necessitates us using a low-level language like C or C++ on that device. OEMs now, today with today's world around software vulnerabilities, software supply chain, they've really tried to request a more independent or more transparent view of what actually goes into their embedded controls. And that kind of forced us to look internally and say, hey, we really need to start looking at our open source policy and open source processes more than we have in the past. One of the nice things out there, and we'll get into this later in the webinar, is a great ISO standard called OpenChain, which really supports, how does a company like Woodward have a robust open source governance process. And finally, looking at kind of how our IT security team, our legal team, and our engineering teams work together to really manage open source and open source compliance in light of like contracts and stuff like that with OEMs or our customers. So on the software supply chain transparency, the what and the why, we've all heard the term SBOM, SBOM, software bill of materials. There's a lot of regulatory compliance coming out around software bill of materials nowadays, especially coming out from the FDA, the National Telecommunications Industry Association, NTIA, other standards like PCI DSS. They're also looking at SBOMs and what goes in their components when you're like doing credit card processing and stuff like that. CRA, the Cyber Resilience Act, which is out in the EU. I'm sure some of our audience members may be familiar with that act that's going to go into effect here in the next couple of years. They're also looking at software bill of materials for what goes into their control systems as far as what makes up a component, what's in there. We're also starting to see, and this has taken a long time to get a lot of traction, our customer and OEM requests for software bill of materials, just so they have a knowledge of what goes into those systems for their own supply chain risk management. And if you kind of have heard the news lately, there's a lot of software supply chain risk out there, and it's just going to get even more so as we kind of saw with what happened last week with the Microsoft issue. Other issues too, you got security and vendor risk management, software bill of materials. If you generally give those to your OEMs and vendors, that gives them another tool in their toolbox for that risk management piece of it. So if they can work with vendors or suppliers like Woodward, or they can manage kind of how their supply chain risk management metrics really match up as far as what they're monitoring from a open source compliance or software package perspective. And then finally, open source licenses. I think this has been one of the biggest struggles that a lot of companies, like Woodward and other people in the cyber physical industry have had around, getting a handle on what that open source compliance looks like, managing intellectual property risks that really kind of come along with open source compliance, and being compliant with licensing requirements that we often see in embedded system packages. How do we have to distribute code? What are rules for contributing back to code? That type of stuff. But all in all, software bill of materials provides a great tool for transparency for cyber physical vendor suppliers and suppliers like Woodward. So what makes embedded development different, especially embedded development? Oftentimes we're seeing a lot of software bill of materials around web and cloud development, which is kind of the normal, if you will, software as a service, that type of stuff that's out and about. Oftentimes on web and cloud development, you're using a higher level language. Language does have good package management around it, like standard package managers like pip, Anaconda, that type of stuff. Oftentimes you have an automated DevSecOps or a continuous integration, continuous development pipeline that's really worked well within those workflows and systems. There's frequent updates to those packages as they're out there and being used. And there's oftentimes graphical user interfaces involved with that kind of package management, or packages that actually go and influence your graphical user interface. On the embedded side, however, it's a little bit different, especially with C and C++. There's not really a good standard package manager that's taken that has kind of a wide adoption. So it's mostly, engineers downloading a package or something like that, maybe integrating it into their build system. The CI/CD pipelines are there, but they may not be as automated. They don't have necessarily the DevSecOps rigor that, say, modern web and software as a service platforms do have. It's getting better, but it's not quite there yet. Oftentimes it's infrequent bundled updates. In other words, people aren't going to check and get continuously updated if there's a new fix, new vulnerability, new patches come out. So it's a lot of manual checking since you don't necessarily have a good package manager. And oftentimes on these embedded systems, you don't necessarily have a user interface. There are embedded systems that maybe support a web browser for configuration and stuff like that, or maybe have an LED, LCD screen that may display some user information and stuff like that. But oftentimes, we're relying upon another computer that would control that fishbowl or that user interface to interact with the embedded system. So all that says, that makes transparency really difficult at times. So you have to really get into the inners of the system and look at the system and make sure that you have those packages updated, stuff like that. And this is where SBOMs really come in handy as far as delivering or having an artifact you can deliver to your end customer about what actually goes into that embedded system. So that is, that's kind of the crux of a lot of this of the webinar. Okay, so kind of touched upon what some of those challenges are as far as the embedded systems. So on the visibility side, it's difficult to know kind of what's inside that software and where it came from. There are scanning tools that are out there that can rely on package managers and stuff like that. But oftentimes on embedded C and stuff like that, they're struggling to provide an accurate inventory about what exactly went into that embedded system as it was being developed or as it was released. Compliance and attribution is another huge challenge. Enforcing those open source compliance rules and requirements around sharing what has changed in the software code, or if you've made a change into an open source package, how do you release that code? Or, some licenses say, okay, you have to deliver a escrow or a version of the code that you used for your build. And then how do we make sure we implement that correctly, identify that requirement in our build process, and create the appropriate artifacts necessary to distribute that source code. And then finally, education and communication. Embedded system engineers may not be used to working in the open source environment, and they may be a little behind the times, if you will, on integrating open source management processes into their development process. Those are some of the challenges. It's a lot of education, a lot of uplifting those engineering teams, to get them kind of up to speed with how open source works, what kind of license compliance challenges are there, and what kind of obligations you might have as an open source user or open source developer for redistributing that source code. So how do you get that visibility without those package managers? Oftentimes we have to isolate binaries in dedicated repositories like Git, Bitbucket, that type of stuff. And analyzing with a scanning tool actually works with C and C++. FOSSA Analyze, the FOSSA command line interface tool, really makes that easy. There are great configuration capabilities with that Analyze tool where we can actually create in a directory structure where we're going to store or where we're going to have that open source item, and then target FOSSA Analyze to include those directories or identify those types of components in there so that we can capture that, put into the FOSSA compliance tool, and monitor our license compliance and dependencies. One of the nice things about this too is we have to make sure that tool is going to be developer friendly. A lot of times developers have different processes and methods for building. Oftentimes, we should have a procedure around that. There are some times when it is the Wild West when you're building and stuff like that. But you also want a tool that's going to work well with a CI/CD pipeline. The FOSSA Analyze tool, the CLI, is really handy because it's pretty simple installation, but it's also very scriptable. Plus, any configuration you put in with it can be archived off in a YAML file, .yml file, or, acronym check, yet another markup language, where you can archive that off into the project. It would be there. FOSSA Analyze gets called by your build server, like a Jenkins, Bamboo, or something like that. And then you have a kind of an instantly configured scan that can then upload that into your FOSSA instance. This is very handy because that makes configuration management a lot easier with our teams, and really puts into the hands of the people that can help make those informed decisions. So that's a great tool. Plus, the robust API on FOSSA helps. If we have the proper connections with our build system, that FOSSA API can give us great information back to our developers in our ticketing system and our dashboards. One of the things that we found in our journey with open source compliance is how do we get a handle on governance of open source? And there's a human element in there, and OpenChain does a great job of kind of setting this up about establishing a software use and review board, or SERB. those are really important because they're stakeholders that are close to the development teams that evaluate and approve that open source usage. So it provides a risk-based avenue for us to evaluate what kind of open source packages we're using, and get that approval sign off around, what that functionality of the package applies. It's a cross-functional collaboration with segment, legal, and IT groups, as well as product cybersecurity. So everyone kind of has a hand in that use and review board. Another added benefit of having a software use and review board too is if we need to contribute, or if we have an opportunity to contribute back to an open source project as a good open source citizen, we have a way to make sure that we do a check to make sure that we're not sending out any Woodward intellectual property that may be inadvertently included in an update out in open source. So that's one aspect of his governance of open source. Next up is vulnerability management. So finding and fixing open source vulnerabilities in embedded systems. That visibility is oftentimes difficult because, again, you don't have a good package manager. Those open source events that have vulnerabilities in there make the news only when it's like a CVE, or you have a really cool name like the recent OpenSSH issue or regression, which means you have to have a logo, you have to have a keyword, all that kind of stuff. But vulnerabilities can happen anywhere, even without logalized vulnerabilities. So how do we identify some of that stuff? Again, FOSSA comes in really handy by having those dependencies uploaded into FOSSA and having a security scan done on the packages that we have. We can identify use of packages across product lines, giving us a much better view as far as our risk goes from a security perspective. One of the things we can definitely look into is, components that are used across multiple product lines, and seeing, identifying kind of what's a low-hanging fruit to fix and address those vulnerabilities. One of the things that we've always heard about kind of in software bill of materials is the whole naming issue or naming convention issue. How do we tell what is, what's really what from a naming perspective? I think one of the recent advances and one of the standards that are kind of catching on here is Perl, the process unified resource locator. I think that's the acronym for it. Not 100% sure. There's a lot of acronyms in cybersecurity. But once that really gets established, that's going to really help, identify where those packages came from and add just another level of provenance to, where that package is at. This also enables us to look at Woodward's process to help flag, prioritize, and execute those fixes. Again, looking at how that particular package may be used across product lines, we may prioritize a fix or a rollout a lot sooner than, say, something may not be used as widely. So that really helps us in our risk management as far as product development and vulnerability response in our product security incident response teams. Those SBOMs finally can really kind of help identify those visibilities and trends in our products, where we're finding multiple vulnerabilities in particular packages. Do we need to make that risk-based decision as far as, do we have to change a package, look for different functionality somewhere else, or how do we handle that from a security perspective, kind of across the board? On the open source compliance side, again, we talked a little bit about open chain, wasn't a ton, but what we really tried to do with our open source software policy inside Woodward is follow this open chain standard. It's an ISO standard that's out there, and I believe it's freely available from the ISO website or IAC website, where you have publicly available standards. But it's ISO IAC 5230, which is just a little bit off of Mile High, but we're out here in Colorado anyway. Anyway, the open chain specification, that's what it's kind of is known as. It's an international standard that really outlines those effective open source compliance programs. It provides that framework to produce or create your own open source management and governance program, and a lot of the tools that are required around with that. With compliance to open chain, you can do self-attestation to this ISO standard, as well as guidance for creating the software use and review boards and training materials. there are copious amounts of training materials on board the OpenChain website, which you can definitely incorporate into your own open source education and policy. Woodward, the great thing about using OpenChain is, we can tie our FOSSA use directly back into how it complies with the OpenChain standard. So we can generate attribution notices, we can automate implementation of license compliance, we can get those stakeholders from our industrial or our legal group involved to look and review like license compliance based on contracts and contract maintenance. So that makes sure that we're compliant with our products that we produce as far as open source licenses go. What's unique about Woodward is we have basically two big business segments, an aerospace segment and industrial segment. Both of them have kind of different needs and uses of open source. Aerospace is going to look a lot different than, say, industrial. So the benefit of kind of the OpenChain process with the guidance it has around software use and review boards, we were able to stand up two software use and review boards, one for aerospace, paying attention to kind of what happens on the aerospace side, and the other one on the industrial. And I think industrial gets a lot more use around open source uses just because of the nature of the products that they produce around industrial control systems. But it's very good to see because we realize that as open source kind of catches on, and we'll see more of it in the aerospace side, we're going to start seeing kind of those two different SERBs serve their purpose around handling their division or their business segments use cases of open source in their industry respective ways is about the best way I can describe that. So what kind of does that software use and review board look like? Again, I mentioned it kind of goes along with our two primary customer segments and stuff like that, or two product line segments. But we really looked at engaging engineering leadership, segment, legal, and compliance folks, and putting together, a robust group of higher level engineers to help drive kind of that SERB mentality. One of the nice things too is it provides engineers with an ability to do some leadership roles, giving leadership giving engineers an opportunity to lead, a compliance effort or governance effort and get used to kind of, doing management. So it's definitely kind of a career path enhancer. Couple things you need to kind of know on SERBs is definitely getting alignment with leadership, engineering leadership. That includes your managers, directors, vice presidents. Educate them, tell them that how this is going to help them with open source compliance. Definitely identify those challenges that we have around licensing compliance, and products that need to have open source compliance and cybersecurity really as part of the key deliverables that we're going to deliver to our customers. The other great thing that OpenChain does, with those resources they have on the website, is it has great elevator speech material. How are you going to explain this in like 5 minutes if you're stuck in an elevator with engineering management? And it really helps drive home, those key points around open source compliance and why it's important in kind of modern day development and stuff. So how do we handle it across teams? Those OpenChain pillars of identifying the clear ownership. We have, with the CI/CD pipelines and build processes, we can do daily FOSSA scans of products that are being built on a nightly basis and see what's changed from a compliance perspective. Sometimes we can automate some of those downloads, get the latest and greatest, and see what's happening on a nightly build. Because every once in a while, an open source package is going to throw in a new license type or a new license requirement, or maybe convert something. And then we kind of have to make that risk-based decision is, do we stay with that package? Is that license still within our risk area? Are we still compliant if we apply to that license? Or do we have to look at a new version of that package or a different vendor, a different open source vendor of that package that may have a more compliant license than we've had in the past? Legal definitely has a stakeholder point of view because they can review, flag, identify items around licensing compliance that we can push down to the build teams or software development teams. Your build failed because your license compliance didn't quite make it. So that enables them to kind of check and see where they have to change stuff or what they have to evaluate from a development perspective. And then IT security can also take advantage of this as well, because they can kind of look into information or information items like around development environments and stuff like that that may be associated with information protection around government contracting, like the NIST 171, DFARS, those types of items. And how do we stay compliant from an information protection perspective? It's always a kind of that first time of getting a development team associated or getting a development team used to open source. And we do have a team here in our corporate engineering group that works with our different business segments in providing critical care to get that FOSSA instance set up, running, making sure that they're not getting any false positives, making sure the directory structures are appropriate and stuff like that. And then just working with the team so that the adoption of the FOSSA tool is smooth. It's a joy to work with. You don't know how important it is to get developers kind of that empowering feeling that they're contributing to the open source compliance of your company, and making the tools easy to use, plus getting the valuable information out of the tool in the first place. Yeah, did I miss one? Okay. So as we all know, in software bill of materials, we have there's multiple formats. There's SWID, which is not listed here, but there's our good old friend SPDX and Cyclone DX. So what version of SBOM, Chris, do you like? And I say yes to both of them. The reason why is many of our Woodward customers, they're playing in multiple industries, or they have industries that maybe are critical infrastructure. And if you look at SPDX and Cyclone DX, both of them have use cases that are complementary to each other. So if we have our software bill of materials, we have our compliance stored in a tool like FOSSA, FOSSA makes it easier to actually produce both of these software bill of materials at the same time. And what does that give us? That gives us a way to archive off a software bill of material as part of our configuration management process, part of a deliverable, stuff like that, and be flexible with customers as far as, hey, we can provide you with an SPDX, we can provide you with a Cyclone DX. What kind of format do you need for your supply chain risk management outcomes? It's really handy. Cyclone DX has some additions around VEX and stuff like that as we kind of go forward in our journey. VEX is really important because it identifies what's actually vulnerable out there in the field. And sometimes, embedded systems take so long to update that a contemporary vulnerability that may have been discovered in an open source package may not impact an older version of that package. Not very often, but it does happen from time to time. So, having a VEX helps you to identify if you're actually vulnerable to an exploit or not. So it's very handy to have. But FOSSA really helps us with, ingesting, analyzing the SBOM in those different formats, and provides an easy way to create those deliverables from our configuration management process and our software delivery process to really kind of empower developers and stuff like that. So, Christian, I think that's kind of the slide deck that we have put together. I think we can open up for Q&A.
Yeah, absolutely. That's awesome, Chris. Thanks for the great walkthrough. I know we're getting several questions already, especially around SBOM, so I'll jump into those here in a second. And as we're going through these, if there's other questions from the audience, feel free to throw them in the Q&A in the chat box. So the first one is around SBOMs. Are you seeing SBOMs being heavily requested today?
Kind of like I said, the traction has taken a while for it to get there, but yeah, they're starting to become more and more requested from our customers, and actually from our end asset owners as part of, one, their supply chain risk management programs, but two, as just part of secure software development, just having that transparency as to what goes into their embedded systems, what goes into their critical infrastructure or industrial control systems that you want to manage and stuff like that. The trend is going to be, it's just going to increase over time, mostly because of executive orders that are out there, like Executive Order 14028, which we've been monitoring for a number of years, and now it's finally just kind of, the procedures and the rulemaking has now finally gotten to the point now it's where we're starting to see those deliverables required in those different industries.
Yeah, awesome. There's the second question actually is related to that one, which is specifically to embedded environments. Like, let me ask the question here: what's going to be important for getting a good SBOM in an embedded environment?
One, it's identifying kind of getting your use case established first, or your open source usage really kind of established first, and your software architecture. It can be a struggle, and it takes a little bit of planning up front to really identify your directory structure, identify what kind of packages you may be implementing or what kind of features some of those packages are going to help out with, and then finally identifying what that software bill of materials looks like. You may as a manufacturer, as a producer, identify some components that are reused across multiple product lines as kind of your internal package, which you can identify and fingerprint with FOSSA and track your compliance on, as far as track your compliance, track your usage of that particular package, using FOSSA across multiple product lines. And I think that's kind of one of those items where we use SBOMs quite a bit for like what kind of open source components go in there, but definitely you can identify kind of what your components from a internal production perspective also get into those product lines and provide some transparency.
Yeah, great call out. And I think you mentioned earlier too around the need for the flexibility between the formats. And I will give FOSSA a shout out for being very good at that. One other question here, specifically around the SERBs. So this question says, I think a SERB would be helpful for us, and maybe like what's the most effective way to get it started internally? I think you mentioned something around leadership. Maybe you can expand on that a little bit more.
Yeah, and it's using those soft skills that security people are good at occasionally, of pitching to engineering leadership why this is important. One, you have to identify kind of in your policy and procedures that you're going to have a software use and review board established, really to help with that governance and compliance around open source software usage. And once you kind of identify that stakeholders and the makeup of your software use and review board, you take it to the leadership, and you tell the leadership, hey, this is going to take X amount of hours per month, and it shouldn't be that big of a lift. In reality, I typically say, hey, look at from a full-time equivalent perspective, like a full-time employee, it might be a 5 to 10% per month. It might be a little bit higher while you're trying to get it started, but as the process kind of rolls, you may find that it may be a 2 to 5% monthly use and review board activity type thing. It's kind of dependent on your appetite for risk, but also, how many people are interested in participating in a software use and review board. And what you'll find oftentimes, especially with like industrial folks that have had experience in open source, they want to be active open source community participants. And having those people and encouraging those people to take part in software use and review boards are huge, because they are kind of the people that set the pace for open source in your company. They're the ones that are going to help kind of drive adoption of open source and have a really robust open source life cycle, if you will, for your groups, and then that really gets the engagement of the engineers established. And once you have engaged engineers, that process can just take off, and it becomes kind of the self-fulfilling prophecy, if you will.
Yeah, it's interesting. It sounds like a lot more human dynamics than just tech and bits and bytes. That's very interesting.
And it is, and oftentimes we hear from a lot of our embedded engineers, what's our open source policy? And this is one of the reasons why we really went ahead and developed that kind of thing, because it can be used as a recruiting tool. If you're an active participant in open source projects, or if you have a robust open source policy that allows you to contribute back to the open source community, that helps tremendously with retention. That helps with engagement in the community, and it shows you that you're kind of a leader in those areas.
Yeah, great call out. The last question I have right now, and if any others have any unasked questions, go ahead and put them in the chat box or the Q&A box there. Last question I have right now is, you mentioned you use C. What are some of the important challenges or considerations with regard to open source when using C?
Yeah, so ANSI C, C++, the big area there is oftentimes going to be your directory structure. Being able to like partition off and segment your directory structure where you have your open source at kind of helps from a management perspective as far software code management or configuration management perspective as far as where are people going to look. And oftentimes from embedded development, you'll be following like an ISO 9001 process or some procedure in your engineering department that may identify coding standards. Take advantage of those. Right in there, hey, open source is going to go in a directory named XYZ or open source, just because that would codify the process in place and allow much easier identification. Legacy stuff, you may have open source stuff mixed up in your normal internally developed source code, and FOSSA does a great job of being able to be kind of wide open and do that open source analysis and pull that stuff in for package identification, which gives you visibility. And then you can always review kind of how you use those, how you have found open source in the legacy projects and make it better, like actively move some of those things around in the build structure, change your build scripts and stuff like that so it's a little more open source conducive. It is a challenge though. Again, package management is not as advanced as say in other languages like Python or Java and stuff like that. So, you have that challenge of having a good package manager, and sometimes you don't even have a package manager, which kind of puts you at a disadvantage. So you have to be very cognizant of what your directory structure looks like, what your configuration management looks like. In addition, when you look at C and C++, you need to look at that coding standard you're going to apply to it to make sure it has not only, the coding rules that your company will publish or will develop towards, but also make sure you have security rules inside there too to keep track of like buffer overflows and all the other nasty fun that a unsafe language like C may have.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That's awesome. Really appreciate you expounding on that one. I'm not seeing any other questions come in right now, so I might move us towards wrapping up. I will call out that some of the things that you talked about today, Chris, around using FOSSA Analyze and creating SBOMs and things like this, we've recently made a lot of these things free to try for people. So for anybody who hasn't tried it yet, you can go to fossa.com and check out the free tier, the free plan that we have. You're able to kind of see how we handle SBOMs in the various formats, see how we handle security, licensing, all of the above, which not a lot of free options out there will let you do today. So I did want to call that out. Chris, thank you so much for leading this talk today. I think this is super insightful for people who are operating in this kind of space. There's a lot of info and intel out there for people that are doing maybe the classic SaaS thing, and but this is different for people like yourself and a lot of our even current customers who are operating in the embedded space. And so really appreciate you taking the time to share your expertise today.
Yeah, no worries. This is a great opportunity. Always, open source is kind of it's a force multiplier. Being able to get functionality and contribute back to open source teams helps out tremendously and helps out everyone. But I really appreciate the support FOSSA's given us as far as the tool set goes internally. Being able to get that compliance visibility down around open source usage and stuff like that. And it's been a great journey. And looking forward to kind of future enhancements and more stuff coming out with FOSSA.
Absolutely. And I did want to make sure I put up this last slide here around how folks can get in touch with you if they want to continue the conversation. Sounds like the best place is LinkedIn.
Yep.
Awesome. Great. And then if there's questions for us, you can reach out to us at hello@fossa.com as well. And with that, I think I'll go ahead and close today. Chris, thanks so much. And for all of our attendees, thanks for joining. We will send the recording out after the event is done. Y'all have a great day. Thank you.